Good evening. We're going to continue our Bible class in the book of Proverbs. I hope that you guys have had a good week so far. It was good to see so many of you out on our Sunday morning worship service. I hope that we can gather together this week in the same location, same time, and maybe even have more of us gather together. I haven't heard anything back from the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation. I plan to drive by their location tomorrow, Bruton Heights, see if anybody's actually in the building. If they're in the building, then maybe we can reach out to them and contact them and find out if they're going to allow us to start renting again. I don't know if that's going to be the case, but I'll drive by tomorrow, hopefully, and get an idea. All right, we are in Proverbs chapter 12. We are continuing on with this section of Proverbs. I mentioned before that the Proverbs themselves kind of start in chapter 10 and they run through the end of the book, even though the last couple chapters are written by other authors. And so here in chapter 12, we're going to continue on with that. And each chapter seems to have kind of its own set of themes. Remember that Solomon has arranged these in a particular pattern. And so while we see some of the statements that are very similar in other areas of the book, what we're going to do is we're going to find out that in those areas, they're going to be slightly different and they're going to kind of fit better into a different context. So Solomon doesn't just repeat things just to repeat things. He is going to repeat them with a purpose. So as we get into chapter 12, he's going to readdress some of these same themes to some degree that we've already looked at, and then he's going to apply them to a slightly different context and draw some additional information out from those things. So here in chapter 12, let's just go ahead and begin there in verse 1. He says, "Whoever loves discipline loves knowledge, but he who hates reproof is stupid." Now, we've kind of talked about this a little bit starting back in chapter 5. If you just kind of skim back over there in chapter 5 in verse 12, he says, "And you say, how I hate discipline, and my heart despises reproof. I do not listen to the voice of my teachers, or incline my ear to my instructors. I am at the brink of utter ruin in the assembled congregation." Back in chapter 5, he's dealing with individuals who are foolish and who have gone after their own ways. In a very similar fashion here in chapter 12, he kind of begins with this idea that if you love discipline, you love knowledge. And that isn't usually how we think of loving knowledge. We usually think of loving knowledge of being studious or liking to read a lot, of someone who maybe enjoys going to school or going to classes. But here he links the idea of discipline with knowledge. And I don't think he's speaking here of discipline as just being structured and being organized or being routined. He is dealing here with discipline in the same context as the next line, that he who hates reproof is stupid. That's what he's talking about, I really believe. So it's interesting that he links those two ideas together, and I think it's kind of not politically correct what he says there, but he's absolutely correct that he who hates reproof is stupid. And the problem is oftentimes we look at that verse and we find ourselves far too often in the second section and not the first. If we're honest with ourselves, that do I enjoy discipline? Do I like when people come along and correct me? And if that isn't the case, then he who hates reproof is stupid. And there in verse 2, a good man obtains favor with the Lord, but a man of evil devices he condemns. That if you are a good man, if you're a good woman, if you follow diligently the precepts of right and truth, that's where favor with God is found. And maybe this seems redundant. Maybe it seems so simple that it's almost on the brink of absurdity that Solomon would include this in all of the other list of wisdom. And yet, this simple statement hits on a point that many people fail to understand for a long portion of their life, or maybe never come to understand. That God is not satisfied in abundance of offerings. He isn't satisfied, he isn't pleased with just shedding of blood or a making of sacrifices, but someone who is truly good. Not one that tries to outweigh the bad with the good, but someone who is concentrated on doing good. But a man of evil devices he condemns. In verse 3, no one is established by wickedness, but the root of the righteous will never be moved. Solomon has talked about this a little bit back in chapter 10 already. And back in chapter 10 in verse 3, the Lord does not let the righteous go hungry, but he thwarts the craving of the wicked. And again in verse 24 of chapter 10, what the wicked dreads will come upon him, but the desires of the righteous will be granted. And again here in chapter 11 in verse 23, the desires of the righteous and only in good, and the expectation of the wicked in wrath. And so he states this again in chapter 12 and verse 3, that no one is established by wickedness. Psalm 127 in verse 1, probably a verse that we're somewhat familiar with. I think we went over this not too long ago on Sunday. That unless the Lord builds the house, those who labor, or those who build it, labor in vain. That unless you establish your life on the principles that God gives you, there is no point to it. You are following down a path that only leads the wrong way. And so he says, if you try to establish your path on wickedness, or establish your life, or any of the principles on wickedness, you're not going to be truly established. He says that the root of righteous will never be moved. Again, David mentions this as you get into the very beginning of Psalms, and that the righteous is like a well-rooted plant going by the rivers of life. And sometimes we see the easy or the quick dollar, we see a good way to get ahead, never realizing that in the end, justice will be served, if not in this lifetime, then in the next. He then gets into verse 4, which is a very small section that is going to look forward to Proverbs 31, that an excellent wife is the crown of her husband, but she who brings shame is rottenness to his bones. Now, he has dealt with the man in the earlier chapters. He dealt with a lot with the man, the individual who wanders off the path that leads to his home and leads down the path that leads to someone else's home, and the ruin and the destruction and the rottenness that he brings. In the same way, he is dealing here with the wife in verse 4. So Solomon is not going to focus only on the man or only on the woman, but he spends time on both camps and mentions that an excellent wife is a crown to her husband, but she who brings shame is rottenness. As we get into verse 5, he's going to touch on one of the main themes for this chapter. The thoughts of the righteous are just, and the counsels of the wicked are deceitful. One of the main themes in chapter 12 deals with honesty, and it deals with the fruit of our lips. And we're going to see this time and time again in chapter 12. Other chapters have dealt with the plots and the plans of the righteous and the wise and the wicked. Some chapters have dealt with how a city, we looked at this last week in chapter 11, that a city is founded on a blamelessness and righteousness. And this time, he's dealing with the fruit of our lips. What does our lips produce? So he says here, beginning with the thoughts in verse 5, that the thoughts of the righteous are just. Remember, what does the Lord require of you in Micah chapter 6 and verse 8? But to love justice, to do mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. One of the key aspects of our walk with God is justice. And our thoughts, if we are righteous, should be just. Now, thoughts are one of those things that other people don't get to see. Only you get to see. And you may have a lot of wrestles in your heart with a lot of things, and you may choose to let, some good things come out, or choose to only let good things come out around certain people. The question comes up, who are you in your inner heart? Who are you whenever in the place where no one can look? Are you someone who your inner thoughts are just, or do you give counsel to others that is deceitful? Again, those are things that no one can answer for except for you. You get to give an answer for those things. And Solomon is asking you to be introspective in this matter and to be honest with yourself, whether or not you are righteous in this area or whether you are wicked. And he'll move from thoughts to other areas in just a few moments. Good evening, Tamika. Good to see you. In verse 6, the words of the wicked lie in wait for blood, but the mouth of the upright delivers them. Again, we're going to continue on this theme. It's going to come up over and over again in this chapter. The words of the wicked lie in wait for blood. Now, we mentioned this already back in chapter 1. We've seen this play out in the life of the Pharisees who laid in wait for Jesus in order to find an opportunity to arrest him and to take him off into death. The words of the wicked lie in wait for blood, but the mouth of the righteous delivers them. Does your mouth seek out to do harm to others? Or does your mouth help deliver others from their own destruction? It's a good question. Verse 7, the wicked are overthrown and are no more, but the house of the righteous will stand. Again, these are very similar statements we've looked at. That nothing is established back in verse 3 by wickedness, but the root of the righteous will never be moved. Very similar statements. As we get into verse 8 down through verse 11, it is a series of statements that are going to flow over time, or flow through these series. So I want to take verses 8 through 11 kind of as a clump. A man is commended according to his good sense, but one of the twisted mind is despised. Better to be lowly and have a servant than to play a great man and lack bread. Whoever is righteous has regard for the life of his beast, but the mercy of the wicked is cruel. Whoever works his land will have plenty of bread, but he who follows worthlessness or worthless pursuits lacks sense. So what he's dealing here with is that introductory phrase there in verse 8, that a man is commended according to his good sense. And what I think he does in verses 9, 10, and 11 is to give you some perspective of what it means to have good sense. And then here in verse 8, also the contrast is the one of twisted mind is despised. So what does it mean to be one of a twisted mind? What does that mean? So we have someone who has good sense, and we have someone who is twisted in mind. And so verses 9 through verse 11, I think, help give us some ideas of that. And maybe there are areas that we wouldn't have considered of being twisted in mind, or someone who has good sense. So consider it. So in verse 9, better to be lowly and have a servant than to play a great man and lack bread. And this plays out in a lot of different ways, and it plays out in a lot of different cultures differently. I want us, to consider it. Try to think of how to phrase this as tactfully as I can. There are certain things in your life that you can put your wealth or your money into, the resources of your labor, that is going to be seen by other people. And maybe give a false sense of how well you are doing financially. There are other things that are good, sound investments. There are things that other people will not necessarily see, but speak volumes to prioritizing. Vehicles, just as an example, are one of those things. Not many people are going to come back to your house and see how nice your house is. Some people will, but most of the people in your life are not going to see that very often. However, there are a number of people who will see your car at the grocery store, at the post office, when you drive it to work, when you drive it to school, whenever you drive it over to any event where they see you. And consequently, a lot of people put a ton of money into a car that looks really nice, and maybe let other things kind of lag behind in their life, in order to give an impression of somebody who is wealthy, someone who's doing really well. And that, I think, is the essence of verse 9. It's better to be lowly and to be working on things than to play a great man and lack bread. If you ever drive into some of the poorer areas of our country or poorer neighborhoods of our surrounding cities, and you will sometimes see what looks to be a very expensive car out in front of a rather ramshackle house, where they could have spent that money into their dwelling or food or any number of other things, and yet they choose to show off with that money in other areas of their life. And that is what he's dealing with. Are we someone who has good sense, or are we someone who has twisted minds? And verse 9 deals with that. Do we live in order to show off and pretend like we have achieved a level of success that we don't, and end up being robbing ourselves in the back end and maybe not having the daily necessities that we need? Or do we live modestly in order that we can meet all of our daily needs? And then he gets into verse 10. Whoever is righteous has regard for the life of his beast, but the mercy of the wicked is cruel. Sunday at services, we got to talk a little bit about this. Or not last Sunday, but the previous Sunday. What the world calls mercy, what the world calls being loving and being forbearing, is not mercy or love towards those whom they kill. I think we've talked about that when it comes to the terms of abortion. And yet for the righteous have regard for the life of their beast. Your animals are quite a bit different than people, if we're very honest. Sometimes we love our dogs, we love our cats, for whoever does love their cats. I'm just kidding. We do love our pets. But they are somewhat transitory in our life. The average lifespan is like an eighth of our lifespan for most of household animals, and sometimes even a lot less. And yet the kind of respect that we show to them, the kind of love that we lavish upon them, has a lot to do with our character. Do we show that much love to other people around us? That is something really big for us to consider. The righteous have regard for the life of their animals, but the mercies of the wicked are cruel. And sometimes we say, well, I love my dog and I'm also pro-abortion. We're trying to blend those two ideas together, and it just works out terribly. Do you have regard for those of lowly status? Do you have regard for all life? Remember, what Solomon does here in the Proverbs is speaks to one specific area that speaks truth to a larger area. So not just individuals who show life or regard for their pack mule or a regard for their yoke of oxen, but individuals who show regard for life as a whole, as opposed to those who, even when they pretend to have mercy, are truly cruel to those under their care. That's what he's dealing with in verse 10. What kind of person are you to those in your power? In verse 11, whoever works his land will have plenty of bread, but he who follows worthless pursuits will lack sense. There are 3 occasions. Hitting all my cords the wrong way. I apologize. 3 times here in the book of Proverbs that he deals with the fact that if you work hard, you get to have enough of your daily needs, is what he gets at. A lot of studies have been done here in the U.S., especially when it comes to being a land of the free, opportunities abound, the American dream, over whether or not that's true, had been true, and continue to be true today. And kind of the general answer is yes. If you just get a job and you work hard and you are reasonable with your cash, then you will be above the poverty line in our country. That's what Solomon is dealing with. But yet there's a lot of people who want to try to skip that whole work process and to jump ahead somehow, and they want to have things that they didn't necessarily work for. Consider the topics of gambling or getting large windfalls by other means. That's what he's dealing with. Individuals who you had the option of either working and having enough to eat, or you have a worthless pursuit who is going to try to get you wealthy fast. And he says that if you do that, you lack sense. So all of these areas, verses 8 through verse 11, kind of all tie together in that topic of a man who has good sense as opposed to one who has a twisted mind. And so while these are kind of diverse areas, all of them lead back to that main subject in verse 8. So, do you pretend to live at a higher income bracket than you actually live in order to show off to others? Or do you live sensibly? That's verse 9. Verse 10 is, how do you handle or treat somebody in your power? Not just animals and not just servants, but how do you treat the people who you have the ability to treat either good or poor? When it comes to the work that you work, do you work with your own hands in order to gain what you need, or do you hope and spend your money to have large amounts of windfall? As we get over into verse 12, whoever is wicked covets the spoils of the evildoers, but the root of the righteous bear fruit. There is a part of humankind that we get enamored with things. I'm no different than anybody else, I think, in those areas. I really enjoy books. I like stories. I like understanding people, their motivations behind those things. A lot of biographies, autobiographies are interesting to me. Life stories, in order to get in people's minds, understand what it is. So true crime novels I find interesting as well. And there is a certain interesting aspect. I read not an autobiography, but a biography on Al Capone. Interesting story. Here is someone who became vastly wealthy through evil pursuits, ended up losing his mind, and he has now a lost treasure that no one has ever figured out where all of his money went. Kind of beside the point. But there's a difference between people who are interested in understanding why people do the things that they do, and individuals who covet the spoils of their evil doing. Are you someone who is content with what you have, whether it be a lot or little, through the own work of your hand? Or do you look at someone else who has gotten vastly rich through unrighteous gains, and you wish that you could have what they have, and maybe even plot and plan how you can do the same? He makes the point here in verse 12 that the root of the righteous does bear fruit. It's not the fruit of of the spoils of evil, but it is a fruit that has a lasting reward. And he'll talk a bit more about that here in chapter 12 as well. He says, an evil man is ensnared by his transgression of his lips, but the righteous escape from troubles. Again, one of those areas where we're dealing with the fruit of the lips. How does our lips define our life? In fact, on my page, if you look directly over into chapter 13 and verse 3, something very similar, that whoever guards his mouth preserves his life, but he who opens wide his lips comes to ruin. So an evil person is ensnared by the transgression of his lips, either promising things he can't fulfill, being caught in his lies, giving false testimony that isn't true. There's a whole host of ways that happens, and Solomon just condenses all of that into one small statement, that an evil man is ensnared by the transgression of his lips, that you tell things that are not true, and eventually they catch up to you. But the righteous person escapes from trouble. The truth is easy because it's true. Now, sometimes it's hard to deal with the consequences. That isn't what he's dealing with. What he's dealing with is that if you deal with the truth, you're never going to have to figure out which lie you told to whom, when, and if it's still true. That's partially what he's dealing with. This concept comes up over and over again. It comes up here in chapter 18 and verse 21 and verse 7, chapter 20 and verse 19, chapter 21 and verse 23, over and over again, that if you lie, those things will bring you into ruin. And in contrast, here in verse 14, for the fruit of his mouth, from the fruit of his mouth, a man is satisfied with good, and the work of a man's hands comes back to him. And here we're making these contrasts and these comparisons. Are you someone here in verse 12 who looks at the spoils of evil doing and covet, or do you labor with your own hands in verse 14 and watch that return come back to you? No. That's an important question for yourself to consider. Verse 14, for from the fruit of his mouth, a man is satisfied with good. Are you satisfied, or do you covet? As you get back into verse 15, the way of a fool is right in his own eyes, but a wise man listens to advice. We looked over in chapter 13 and verse 10. By insolence comes nothing but strife, but with those who take advice is wisdom. Chapter 19 and in verse 20. There in verse 20, listen to advice and accept instruction, that you may gain wisdom in the future. Remember how we talked about how humility is kind of key to a lot of what we're talking about. It is key to seeking advice. It is hard sometimes to listen to other people tell you how to do the thing that you are so desperately wanting to learn. And it's a weird quirk of human nature that I want this, I want to succeed, I want to do well, but I also want to do well on my own terms without anybody's help. I like to stand on my own, and that is kind of a weird thing if you think about it. Here someone offers you how to get ahead faster and do it right and better and quicker with a little bit of help. But because it requires humility, sometimes we get so angry over that. And what Solomon says here is, the way of a fool is right in his own eyes. If you keep your own counsel, that's another way of looking at it. Are you someone who thinks of a way that you're going to do it, and then you do it, and if it works out, it works out. If not, then you'll do it another way. But never seeking advice is not, seeking advice is just never going to be a part of your life. If that's the case, then he mentions here that you're a fool for being right in your own eyes. But if you listen to advice, you're wise. In abundance of counselors, there is security. Here in verse 16, the vexation of a fool is known at once, but the prudent ignores an insult. Again, these two ideas are going to be kind of tied hand in hand. There are some times where you get advice, and sometimes that advice is lousy. Sometimes people give insult, believing that they're giving advice. And you have to be able to take both. You can't be someone who takes an insult at what you think is not advice. Sometimes it is advice and you think it's not. But you have to be someone who's willing and able to hear both and react well to both insult and to advice. Sometimes they may be one and the same, and we need to be willing to be able to take it. He says the vexation of a fool is known at once. Verse 29, or chapter 29 in verse 11. Solomon writes here in verse 11 that a fool gives vent to his spirit, but a wise man quietly holds it back. He isn't speaking here of the idea that you just always keep your opinions and your feelings to yourself, but there is a processing time that we should take. And I think we teach our kids, count to 10, take a walk, go cool off, figure out a way to hold it in until you can process things properly and you can get a grip on your emotions and then deal with them productively. And Solomon says that if you're someone who just vents immediately, if you just react, if you just automatically have something to retort and something to say, and if I'm just expressing myself, he says that you're a fool if it's known immediately. But if you're able to ignore insults and just move on with your day and get over it, he says then you're prudent. And these are things that I wish that was taught more in today's society, and it isn't because people don't value the scriptures. And I hope that these are things that we can apply to ourselves, and then we can teach diligently to our children. One of the biggest helps growing up was we took the preacher where I grew up walked away from the adult class for several months and took all the teenagers through Proverbs. I think that is a great practice. This is the time period where this stuff becomes very effective. If you can teach people at that critical junction of their life to learn wisdom, to seek it, to hear advice, to get, just to fluff off insults and to keep moving with their life. These things take root in someone's life and produce great things over time. Verse 17, continuing with the theme of the fruit of the lips and how we work with our mouths. Whoever speaks truth gives honest evidence, but a false witness utters deceits. And that isn't just about an eyewitness to a crime or an eyewitness to an accident. And this is just an eyewitness to life. That if you give honest evidence, truth comes along with that. False witness utters deceits. And then we'll move down into verse 19, verse 22 in a few moments and pick up that theme again of the fruit of the lips. Verse 18, there is one whose rash words are like sword thrusts, but the tongue of the wise brings healing. Chapter 4, in verse 22, Solomon writes, speak of the words of wisdom, for they are life to those who find them and healing to all of their flesh. Do you take time before you speak to think about what you're going to say? Is it going to be something that is truthful? Or is it going to be something that's going to be helpful to them? Is it something that's going to bring healing to them? Or do we react and just jab with them? And sometimes we have justified our sword jabs, which is mostly our venting of our own frustration, in the guise of speaking truth. It doesn't mean, let me go ahead and finish that idea. Sometimes in the cover of speaking truth, we jab and stab at people not to help them, not to aid them in their knowledge or to correct them in their course of life, but we do it to vent our own frustration. And Solomon makes that point that those are rash words and they don't produce the results that God's looking for. He says the tongue of the wise brings healing. It is true that sometimes you have to further an injury in order to make things better. If you ever get a splinter in your finger, it's usually a small hole that the wood goes into, and sometimes you have to make a larger hole to get that splinter out. Sometimes whenever there is problems in people's lives, you can't just go in and say, let's correct this one issue and it be painless. You have to change the way that their thought process is. You have to help them see the mistake. You have to get them to mourn over their sins, and that can be a very hard process. There's going to be pain involved in that. But it's the wise person who knows how to handle that for their good and for their benefit, as opposed to the one who is just lashing out in anger and trying to throw truth at them in order to injure or to prove wrong. I want us to consider the difference between those two things. I can speak truth to you in a way that is damaging to you, that makes truth seem unappealing and will not help you. I can also speak truth to you in a way that is going to help you to heal, even if it hurts some in the process, or even hurts a lot in the process. One are rash words, and the other are words of a wise person. And understanding your mixed motives, understanding how you're doing something and whose benefit you're speaking for is vital to that. And that's what's so beautiful about Proverbs. I don't want to get overly poetic about all my feelings on Proverbs, but that's the beauty that the whole concept is wrapped up in this short phrase that hopefully we can commit to memory. There is one whose rash words are like sword thrust, but the tongue of the wise brings healing. That we should be able to remember that, and then whenever it comes to us, and we're going to retort against somebody, or we're going to point out their sin, or we're going to lash back at them for the wrong things that they have done in their life. Hopefully, Proverbs 12 and 18 will pop in our minds and say, well, hold on, am I going to use truth like a sword thrust because I'm being rash with my own mouth? Or are my words going to bring about healing to them? It's huge. There's a reason that Paul deals with this over when Paul writes to Timothy and tells us that we, as God's servants in 1 Timothy chapter 2 and 22, should not be quarrelsome, but able to teach, gently correcting our opponents. That there's a manner in which we do it that is also important, not just that we do it, but we do it in a way that benefits them and it glorifies God. In verse 19, we looked at verse 17, whoever speaks truth gives honest evidence. Verse 19, truthful lips endure forever, but a lying tongue is but for a moment. Deceit is in the heart of those who devise evil, but those who plan peace have joy. No ill befalls the righteous, but the wicked are filled with trouble. Lying lips are an abomination to the Lord, but those who act faithfully are his delight. All of these ideas, again, come together with the question of how do we handle our own tongues? How do we handle our lips? What is the produce of the things that we speak every day? Are they truthful? Are they things that are going to last and endure? Do they deceive? Do they devise evil? Are they ones who speak lies, which are abomination? Or do our lips prove our faithfulness to God and therefore make us his delight? And again, those are things for us to self-evaluate over. In verse 23, the prudent man conceals knowledge, but the heart of the fool proclaims folly. And again, we've talked about this concept as well. And what he's dealing here with in verse 23 is not, I know the answer to this, your math question, but I'm just going to refuse to give it to you. Or I know the capital of Denmark, but I just will never tell anybody else. What he's dealing with here is if there's a confidence between two people, and it would make for a really good juicy gossip. A prudent person conceals that. He just doesn't speak of it. But the heart of a fool proclaims folly. I'm going to go and tell everybody, as opposed to just telling you. If I see you doing something that is unwise or foolish, Jesus tells us in Matthew that we go and we talk to that person directly. And then, if you will not receive it, then bring one or two witnesses along with you in order for that word to be established. And then only after those efforts fail, then bring it before the church. And I want us to consider that process. Who do we talk to first? And far too often we as humans have the habit of telling pretty much anybody else other than the person that we have an issue with. And usually it's the worst people to tell. I don't know why we do that so often. It's not like we go and tell people who are, they're going to have amazing advice and they're going to be able to fix the problem. We don't do that. We find people who are low of mind like we are when we tell them, who are going to snicker and laugh and tell other people also. Well, we start off with, I'm going to tell you this, but you don't tell anybody else, and they're going to go around doing the same thing to everybody else. It's a huge issue. But if you follow God's pattern, I'm going to talk to you directly. I'm going to conceal that in order to do something good for you to make the change. And then, if necessary, I'm going to find one or two other people who are going to help in the scenario and not make things worse. And then after that, then we're going to deal with the church as a whole. Not the world in general, but the church. The prudent man conceals knowledge, but the heart of the fool proclaims folly. There's a lot of things that we kind of do out of habit or out of nurturing in our society that we wouldn't think of ourselves as being fools, and Solomon fingers us for exactly that. He says, the hand of the diligent will rule, while the slothful will be put to forced labor in verse 24. Again, this is kind of what he dealt with back in verse 9. It's what he has dealt with, that the righteous will have plenty to eat earlier on as well. That it's the diligent person who's going to succeed in their business. And it's the slothful that are going to really suffer in those areas. And so we'll pick up on some of those as we get further on into Ecclesiastes or Proverbs as well. He says the anxiety of a man's heart weighs him down, but a good word makes him glad. And you can see that in people. Whenever they're having bad days, you can see them slump, their heads cast down, their countenance fall. Anxiety weighs on you. And as Christians, we are told not to be anxious anything, but to meditate on good things, a good word. I mean, quite literally, the gospel is the good news or the good word. To meditate on that is good and pure and just and noble and things of commendable value. And yet, how many times do we feed ourselves on a regular diet of anxiety-inducing news? Just an idea. In verse 26, the one who is righteous is a guide to his neighbor, but the way of the wicked leads them astray. We get to see this concept play out in a couple different places. Job chapter 29 in verse 15, Job claims that he was a guide to the blind, that he guided other people along. Jesus, in contrast, tells the Pharisees that they are blind guides. Not a guide to the blind, but they themselves are blind and then are going to become guides to other people. And then Paul in Romans chapter 2 and in verse 19 accuses the Jews, are you really fulfilling the old law? Are you truly guides the blind? Are you helping those who are fatherless and widows? It's a derogatory thing in chapter 2 that they didn't do that. And here Solomon kind of pushes forth this idea that if you're righteous, you're a guide. And he isn't just dealing with the idea that you're going to either train seeing eye dogs or you're going to go out and you're going to grab blind people by the hand and walk them around town, which would be a great thing to do, either one of those things, don't get me wrong. But his point here is not just to guide blind people around. His point is that those who are around you, do you guide them towards God? That's the key. Do you guide them with righteous words and with truth? Do you give that knowledge that brings healing? Or do you lead people astray? Or do you let people continue to be led astray by a lack of speaking truth? Important things. Verse 26, the one who is righteous is a guide to his neighbor, but the way of the wicked leads them astray. You can lead people astray either by just simply not doing anything or by actively doing that. The last two verses, whoever is slothful will not roast his game, but the diligent man will get precious wealth. The path of the righteous is life, and in its pathway there is no death. Two main themes I would suggest for Proverbs chapter 12. One is the fruit of lips, and one is the fruit of honest labor. Those two things go hand in hand here in Proverbs chapter 12. Do you work diligently with your own hands, and are you content with those things? If you work diligently, you'll have what you need. And if you don't, if you're slothful in those things, then he mentions here in verse 24, forced labor. He mentions here that you won't be able to roast your own game, your own meat, that you won't have all that you need. And that comes with being slothful. He also deals here in Proverbs, we're not going to get into it tonight because it's another chapter, the idea that a little slumbering of the eyes, a little folding of your hands to sleep, and those who love sleep, as he deals with also, are individuals who are going to come to ruin. Are you someone who gets up and is happy to get up and to do an honest day's work? And when it comes to the fruit of your lips, do you speak truth? Do you help others? Do you guide them along the path of right? Do you do it in a way that is going to bring healing to their life? Or do you use it as ways to jab them with rash words like sword thrust? Important things. I hope that chapter 12 has been interesting to you. I hope that you take some time and to memorize some of these. That's one of the great and beautiful things of Proverbs is that you can find the ones that maybe you fail in the most, and you can say, well, here's a proverb that I truly need to put into practice. Here's an area of my life that this one is particularly applicable on a regular basis. There are some things that maybe aren't as fitting to your life, but some of them are going to be extremely fitting to your life. And those are ones that you can go back and say, I want to memorize these ones. I want these ones to pop into my head as often as they can in these scenarios. And I would highly suggest you take some time, find those, underline them, copy them into a notebook, put them on the mirror, put them up in your car as you drive along, wherever you want to. Make it so you see them, and make it so that they're before your eyes all the time, so that this can be a part of the wisdom that is always kind of percolating your mind to fit different scenarios. Next week, Lord willing, we're going to pick up in chapter 13 and continue on in our study of Proverbs. I hope you guys have a great week, and Lord willing, we will see you guys on Sunday. Have a great night, and see you guys then. Bye.